Alrighty, and we are back. Podcast number 4 is on deck today. I just want to say before we get into this podcast, and trust me, we got a lot of stuff to get into today. I'm really excited about this podcast, and I hope y'all will enjoy it as well. I apologize for not making a really thorough podcast last week. I had quite a few things to do for school. Those of you at Chapel Hill know what I'm talking about. We just had quite a few things to do and as well. But I was able to produce a small update video about Thursday, I believe it was, where I made a couple predictions and I talked about what was going on in the week and how the weekend was going to shape up. But I noticed I didn't have too many views on that, which is perfectly fine. I don't expect to get a lot of views on these, obviously, but I didn't. Obviously, that lower number of views, it doesn't mean that y'all were able to get the update as many as I would have intended, at least, which is perfectly fine. I didn't really send it out to anyone. That's all good. With that, but so just because of that, I wanted to take this time at the beginning of this podcast just to update y'all on where I am. I'm still good to make podcasts the rest of the year, time management, everything like that. We're doing well in that regard, and I shouldn't have to skip too many more weeks of podcast. If I do, I'll let y'all know. But I should be pretty good from here on. But obviously, I mean, everything's subject to change. We live in a very interesting and difficult world right now, and a lot of stuff is going on. A lot of pain is out there, a lot of suffering as well. And there's a lot bigger things right now going on in life than college football. But college football is a great thing. Y'all, let's tune in the podcast for that. Not updates on wars in the Middle East, coronavirus, none of that. Y'all tune into this, politics, y'all tune in for college football. And that's what I'm going to provide. That's what I do, and that's what this podcast is for. So let's jump into what we have on deck today. I'm going to talk about the Big 12 and how it is officially done. Finally. Those of you who know where I'm coming from on this, you understand. I'm so tired of the Big 12, mainly Oklahoma, getting into the college football playoff, losing by 50 points to the number one seed, whoever they are, and going home every single year. I'm so tired of that, and now that will not happen this year. I'm so excited for that, but we'll get into more of that here shortly. The ACC, we're going to talk about that and how I feel the ACC is a very strong conference this year, and I'll justify some of my claims for that after I talk about the Big 12. Then we're going to jump into the SEC and how Georgia has really solidified itself as a solid playoff contender. And their looming matchup against Alabama is going to prove to be pivotal in that role. But it may not be a deal breaker for the playoff committee. And we will talk about why when we get to the SEC. Last two things I'm going to talk about just very briefly at the end of the podcast. We're going to talk about the Pac-12 and how it is officially back and they just announced the schedule over the weekend. A lot of Friday night games there. Not too much to talk about there because mainly no one watches the Big 12 or Pac-12 unless you're on the West Coast, but they are back, and we'll talk about that briefly. And then lastly, but certainly not least, we're going to talk about the Big 10 and Ohio State versus the field is my subheading for that one. For those of you who don't know, I created a small outline. It's sitting on my computer right now, actually, and I have my phone resting against my laptop as well. And I literally have an outline, very brief, no real notes here. And I just try to go off the top of my head. So with that, let's jump into the Big 12 being officially done. For those of you who don't know, both Oklahoma and Texas lost on Saturday. Oklahoma losing to Iowa State and Texas losing to TCU. I'll be honest, I was not able to see the entirety of the Texas-TCU game and analyze it in its entirety to the depth of which I would have wanted. Multiple reasons for this. I was actually in Lexington, North Carolina. For those of you who don't know, that's about an hour and a half west of Raleigh, not east, my bad. West of Raleigh. My aunt is turning 50, and we went to my grandma's house to meet her there with my cousin and cousins and uncle and all that. And we're able to have a brief celebration. We got back to Raleigh in mid to late afternoon around 6 o'clock. We were just hanging out there, had lunch and everything like that. And so I wasn't able to watch the noon games as much as I wanted. I caught the second half of the 3:30 games and obviously all of the night games for that matter. But I did see the fumble that Texas made, and it really just goes to show that Texas is not necessarily back yet. They're just not there yet. And one thing I'm just going to go off on a tangent here. One thing I'm going to say is yesterday in college football, I don't know if y'all noticed this. This was kind of an underlying theme. there were quite a few plays across the country for a broad number of teams where players would get out in the open. They would put the 2 up like a cheetah, like the Tyreek Hill does for the Chiefs, and they would be tackled from behind. And this happened 4 or 5 times yesterday. I was like, this is something I need to talk about. This is something I need to note in the podcast. And I found that so interesting. And ironically, it actually happened in the Texas game. Deontay Foreman, I believe that's what his name is. It may not be, though. He was tackled from behind, and then 2 plays later, he fumbles on the goal line, gives the ball to TCU, and TCU wins the game. That's just a side tangent. There's no necessarily a significance to that. I just thought it was interesting enough to mention. But Texas loses. They are officially done. Oklahoma loses to Iowa State in a great game. I hope y'all were able to tune into that one. That was an unbelievably good game, and it seemed very loud. I know we have a crazy year this year and a reduced capacity, and between 20 and 25%, sometimes even less, depending on what state you're in or depending on what stadium you go to, the university guidelines, stuff like that. But it did seem like Iowa State had a very solid crowd presence, and that rattled, no pun intended, Spencer Rattler in certain regards. That last throw that he made that ultimately sealed the victory for Iowa State was a lofted throw into double coverage. And while it wasn't necessarily a awful decision, it was not a great decision by any stretch of the means. He probably should have held that, throw it away, live to fight another day. There's always certain thing you can always, a throwaway is not always the end of the world. If you just live to fight another day, who knows, maybe they win, they take it to overtime. The better team usually wins in overtime, and they could very well done it then, although it is difficult to play on the road in overtime and everything like that. But still, who would have known? No one really does. So those are the 2 main things for the Big 12. Oklahoma's done. Texas is done. The Red River rivalry, while it will be interesting, of course, because it's Texas and Oklahoma, a bunch of history in that game, a lot of importance there. It's not going to hold the same significance as it has in the past years, but that doesn't render it obsolete, to be completely honest. I think it's actually going to be a great game. I'm looking at 2 teams here. Oklahoma I actually think is a little bit better, even though they have a worse record. I think the program of Oklahoma as a whole is better than Texas's program right now. But that does not mean Texas's program is necessarily bad, but it's not great. And Texas in modern history has not been nearly as good as Oklahoma has. Consistently. Yes, they had the national championship run in, I believe it was 2009 to against Alabama, which ultimately Colt McCoy got injured and they lost the game. But if you look at the majority of the years, especially within the last 10 years, Oklahoma has dominated that rivalry. Oklahoma has dominated the Big 12, and Oklahoma has subsequently dominated that region within the Big 12 in college football playoff appearances. No national championship appearances, but college football playoff appearances nonetheless, which is still an unbelievable season by any stretch of the means. Making the college football playoff is something incredibly difficult to do. And to do it for the number of years that Oklahoma has, although they have not made the national championship, and although they tend to get blown out every year in the first round, it's still an accomplishment, and almost every team in the country would be more than willing to trade places with Oklahoma. And so, that even with the losses, it's still a big deal to make the college football playoff. But that's enough for the Big 12. I'm done talking about the Big 12 this year. I hope to never revisit the Big 12. It's been a mess. It's been awful. This has been a horrendously bad year. A historically bad year for the Big 12 in multiple regards. And I'm glad I don't have to talk about them anymore. I shouldn't say I will never talk about it again, because if something bad enough happens where it is worth mentioning of how bad there was a loss or something like that, or God forbid Texas wins out and has a chance to make the college football playoff, which isn't happening, but God forbid it does, or something of that nature, then I might talk about them again. But as of right now, I'm not planning on talking about them again at all. Now, after we talk about the Big 12, let's jump into the ACC. I wanted to say in my subheading here, the ACC is very strong this year, and I don't necessarily think we've seen a year that the ACC might be as deep. And let me clarify this by saying deep. In years past, okay, the ACC has been Clemson and everyone else, okay? And the everyone else has been relatively at the same level Basically, you have 8 to 10 teams in the ACC that are the exact same team with different helmets on. We're talking, I mean, you ask the average person out there, the average college football fan for that matter, and you ask them to tell you the difference between NC State, North Carolina, Duke, Wake Forest, Virginia Tech, Miami, and man, who's another one like that? Boston College. I mean, you ask them to sort those teams in order from best to least. You ask 10 people, you'll probably get 10 different answers. They're the same team with different helmets on, and what's that's rendered down to, what's that's culminated into, is one team finishing like 9-3 and the other team finishing 3-9, and it's just that subset. You have constant differing in that regard because you have teams that are basically the same skill level, have the same level of coaching, but just aren't that good. They've all been the same. They've all been significantly behind Clemson. This year, I don't think we have that again. I think you have some of it, but not nearly to the same extent that we've had in the past. For instance, Clemson's very, very good. I think we all know that. Miami is very solid. Miami is a sound team. And in this Clemson versus Miami game, 1 versus 7 is going to be a great game on a Saturday. And I very much look forward to it. I wish we had a normal world. This game would be incredibly loud in Death Valley if we were to have that. But unfortunately, we just don't have it this year. Although it'll still be pretty loud in Death Valley. Not super loud, not nearly as loud as it normally would have been. But it will be relatively loud. And that game is going to obviously solidify the first place in the ACC and could very well be, and we could very well see a rematch of that game in the ACC championship game. I do think Miami's a real contender this year. North Carolina, I'm going to be completely honest, has looked subpar to open up this year. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad team. I really don't think Carolina's a bad team. And I think Carolina will get rolling here pretty soon. There's a lot of firepower on UNC right now, and they've got a solid national championship winning coach. And I do think that bright days are ahead for Carolina. I'm trying to go to the Carolina game. I put my ticket in for the lottery, hoping I get to go. We'll see what happens there, and I look forward to that. Carolina's got Virginia Tech this upcoming weekend. Outside of that, Carolina and Miami are very, very strong. Virginia Tech is a strong team. They're not bad at all. So really what I'm trying to say here, I think the gap, while it's not very close still, I think the gap has narrowed marginally between Clemson and the rest of the ACC. And I also think there's a subset of ACC teams that's smaller than it has been in the past that are basically very similar teams or close in skill level to other teams. But I do think there's basically, instead of a 2-tiered system in the ACC where it's Clemson and everything else, I think it's Clemson, and then you got to go down a couple steps and you get to Carolina, Miami, and Virginia Tech, and then you go down a couple steps and you find the rest of the teams. We're talking our Wake Forest or NC States. And then obviously all the way at the bottom, you have your Florida States, Syracuses, that type of stuff. Pitt you can throw in there in the middle tier as well, close to the NC State in that regard. So really the ACC is going to be a strong conference this year. Virginia shocked me. I'm going to be completely honest. I thought Virginia played a great game against Clemson on Saturday. They had a really solid game plan there, and they played solid on both sides of the ball. Really not a ton of mistakes made, except for the fact they took 3 timeouts within the first quarter. How your coaching staff is that ill-prepared makes no sense to me. You can't call 3 timeouts in the first quarter and be a college level team. What in the? I mean, that's like high school stuff. Come on, guys. But that's what Virginia did. And so for those of you who may not have been able to listen to the update, a key thing I wanted to talk about or bring over from that is I talked in the update about how I really did think Clemson was going to cover the spread. I thought Clemson was going to come out guns blazing. I thought Clemson was going to play very well in this game. And I'm not going to come out here in the following podcast, and say that Clemson did not play well, because I think Clemson did play pretty well. But Clemson did not play to the level that we're used to seeing from a Tiger team, especially coming off a bye week. It almost looked like Clemson was sleepwalking to some extent, but still an 18-point win. It's a solid win. The game was never in question, to be honest, but it wasn't as dominating of a performance that you would like to see. That may not be a bad thing for Clemson, though. Usually in this early part of the year, Clemson doesn't necessarily struggle. Sometimes does struggle, but not always really struggle. And that's probably not the best word, but just doesn't look as outstanding as by the end of the year. And eventually Clemson kicks it in gear. Usually it's coming after a scare. I can tell you that from personal experience. Obviously Syracuse in 18, Carolina in 19, Syracuse in 17, Pitt in 16. There wasn't really a scare. There were a few scares in 15, mainly Florida State. That was actually the first game ever after Clemson had been ranked number 1 and taken the field as the number 1 team in the history of in the program. But, I mean, that's just kind of random for that matter. But there's usually a scare game that hits Clemson, and usually we rebound from it quite well. And I fully expect Venables and Dabo to have these guys ready to go for Miami because this is a different animal than Virginia. Virginia is not a bad team. And to be completely honest, Virginia will probably end up ranked by the end of the year. I could very well see them being in the top half of the ACC. They're a very solid team. And this was definitely a wake-up call for Clemson, and I really do expect Clemson to come out hot against Miami and Hungary, especially after that lackluster, not a bad, but just less than what we're used to seeing in that regard. But I will say this, some credit has to be given to Virginia in that regard. I made my prediction based upon the presupposition that Clemson could make Virginia uncomfortable. And even with the score, I never saw Virginia get uncomfortable, and that you have to give credit to Bronco Mendenhall. They did not stick away from the game plan. Now, their game plan was never going to win them the game. There was no doubt in my mind that Clemson was going to lose this game, ever. Clemson was in thorough control of this game, but Bronco Mendenhall did not switch up his game plan even after stuff wasn't necessarily working. And the toughest thing, the thing that best shows this, is if you go back and look at the game tape, when Virginia would throw the ball specifically, Virginia tends to basically run an offense of take whatever the defense gives you every single time and don't do anything else. If you look back at the game tape, you can see that pretty much every time a Virginia receiver or tight end catches the ball, they're hit almost immediately. And that's because they run a lot of curls, a lot of underneath passes, and it's stuff that you can't really make them uncomfortable with because they just stick in that. They're never going to be that aggressive. They're not going to throw the ball downfield a lot. They're going to take what the defense gives them every single time. And what ends up happening, what ends up resulting in, I should say, is a lot of 3rd and 1s, 3rd and 2s, 3rd and 3s, 3rd and 4s, 3rd and 3s, 3rd and 1s, more manageable 3rd down situations. And that's to Virginia's schematic credit. That was a good job by Virginia. Brent Venables, Clemson DC, likes to make offenses uncomfortable and likes to force offenses into 3rd and 8s, 3rd and 9s, 3rd and 10s, obvious passing downs. And by doing that, you can use a speed defense like Clemson to get pressure on the quarterback very quickly and force an unwanted throw. It can lead into interception, a sack, or at least a breakup for that matter, pass breakup for that matter. But Virginia didn't do that. You didn't see that same scheme. And I thought Venables would have been able to get that, but you have to give credit for Virginia there. Virginia played a very good game, and they're going to be a tough out for a lot of teams just because their nature of offense, how long they hold the ball, and how they take what the defense gives them every single time. It honestly gets annoying. But that's why they do it. It wreaks havoc with the defense because it's just so hard to try to jump in front. The only way you can really stop it is try to jump and guess. And that is to Virginia's credit. And I got to give Bronco Mendenhall high praise in that regard. So Virginia's not a bad team. Clemson didn't look as great as I thought they would, but we should see a much better Clemson team, or at least probably about the same level Clemson team, a much better Clemson performance, much more customary to what we're used to seeing this coming Saturday against Miami. Now moving into the SEC, Georgia, after their dominating win over Auburn, 27-6 win, has thoroughly cemented themselves as a playoff contender. But as I said earlier, this might not necessarily be, let me go back and just say this. Georgia is definitely a playoff contender, and they have a very big upcoming game against Alabama, but that game may not be a deal breaker for the college ball playoff, and I'll explain why. First of all, let me say this. Georgia is a very good team. There is no doubt in saying that. Georgia's a very strong team. Georgia's got an unbelievably good defense. But, I'm not sure if Stetson Bennett is the permanent answer at quarterback. Let me say that again. I'm not sure that Stetson Bennett, the fourth, is the permanent answer at quarterback. He could very well be the quarterback that leads Georgia through this season. He could very well be the quarterback that leads Georgia to the SEC championship game and has Georgia go 9-1. But he is not leading Georgia to an undefeated national championship. There is no chance that Georgia is winning the national championship with Stetson Bennett. It's just not happening. Georgia is a very, very good team, and they are talented in almost every single position. But a 5'9" walk-on quarterback is not winning the national championship in modern-day college football against a team that has comparable talent to Georgia and a comparable coaching staff. It's just not happening. For instance, you look at the last couple national champions we've had in college football. Almost every single one of them has had incredibly dynamic quarterback play. You go back to last year, Joe Burrow. The year before that, Trevor Lawrence. The year before that, it was Tua Tagovailoa. The year before that was Deshaun Watson. And really, the last one you can think of that wasn't a dynamic quarterback was Jake Coker in 2015. But keep in mind that national championship win for Alabama in 15 was less about Jake Coker and more about just an unbelievably good game plan by Nick Saban with with an onside kick and a kick return. That's the only reason why Alabama won that national championship, and that's the only reason why Clemson is not back-to-back champions in 2015 and 2016. But that's nevertheless, Jake Coker is basically the last quarterback that we've seen that wasn't perfectly outstanding to win the national championship. But even back before that, I mean, Jameis Winston in 13, who won it in 14? Cardale Jones won it in 14, and although he wasn't the most dynamic quarterback of all time, he played very, very well in the playoff. You go back to, I guess, that would have been the main one. So basically in this modern era of college football, we're talking the last 5 to 7 years, you've really had to have outstanding quarterback play to win a national championship. It's very difficult if you don't. And I'm not sure Stetson Bennett is the man that can do that for you permanently. That doesn't mean he's bad. Georgia's obviously going to rely heavily on the run game no matter what they do, no matter who the quarterback is for that matter. I just don't know if they can't figure out a better quarterback and they have to roll with Stetson Bennett for the rest of the year. I don't know if Georgia can beat Alabama, and I really don't know if they can beat them twice, which is basically what we're at now. For those of you who've been watching the season, you should agree with me on this. The SEC is basically, it's a strong conference this year, but it's come down to a two-person race, and you're probably going to see Alabama and Georgia play twice this year, one in the regular season with Georgia going on the road to Tuscaloosa, and one in Atlanta for the SEC championship game. I don't see any other SEC team that's really that strong. Yes, Tennessee's undefeated, but I mean, come on now. Tennessee is not nearly at the level of Georgia or Alabama right now, not even close for that matter. And there's a lot of other SEC teams that have just lost and are not that great. I mean, look at Mississippi State. They beat Ole Miss one week. They come out and lose to Arkansas. You heard that right. Arkansas. Team hasn't won an SEC championship or a SEC game in like 3 years. I mean, that's literally since Jack and Jill last cracked corn and came down the hill, for that matter. I mean, they went up the hill, but we never knew when they went down the hill. But they came down the hill by the time that Arkansas had won their first SEC game, what felt like an eternity. So it's just a lot of inconsistency. It looks like we're going to have UGA and Alabama twice this year, which wouldn't be a bad thing at all. But I'm not necessarily sure if Stetson Bennett can get it done permanently at UGA. But more on that later as we come up to the UGA-Alabama game. I'll make sure to provide thorough analysis on that game. I'll make sure to watch that game definitely, or to the best of my ability. I'll try to make sure I'm able to watch it, and I can provide some commentary on that as well. Moving into the next point here, the Pac-12 is back. I didn't look at the schedules too much, to be completely honest, but I did notice a theme in the scheduling. There's a lot of Friday night games, and I actually think this is a very good job of the Pac-12. You know, on normal college football Saturdays, you have the night games that begin at 8 o'clock or so on the East Coast, and then you have these Pac-12 games that start on 11 to 10:30. Sometimes even 11:30 at night, and it's just so hard. Like, I love college football, but don't get me wrong, but I do not want to watch Arizona play Oregon State at 2 in the morning. And that's just so late, and it's not their fault. Time difference obviously contributes to this, but I just can't. I can't do that at night. So by putting it on a Friday night, more people are going to be able to watch. You're going to democratize the viewers for the sport and for the conference, which I think is going to draw a lot more attention to the Pac-12, and I think it's going to give them a little bit more of a voice, which is a very good thing. And I think by allowing more people to see it, just by playing at a better time, in a time that you're not going to be overshadowed by other Power 5 conferences, I think that's a great job by the Pac-12. And lastly here, I won't talk about this for too long because they haven't played yet, but the Big Ten, I'm very high on Ohio State this year. I'm just going to go out here and say it. I saw how good Ohio State was last year, and I know they lost quite a few people off the offense and the defense, but when you look at Ohio State, they recruit so well. Their coaching staff is so deep, and they're going to be a very good team year in and year out regardless. I mean, Ohio State's been great the last couple of years. They've had the slip-ups, and obviously in teams they really shouldn't have had slip-ups to, but Ohio State's been a very good team, let me tell you that, over the last couple of years. And I think Ohio State's going to be very strong this year, especially with Justin Fields at quarterback. I fully expect them to blow through the Big Ten, and I fully expect them to be undefeated and in that fourth spot of the college football playoff. Fully expect. I don't know if they can get above the fourth spot just because they're not going to play as many games as everyone else, but I do expect them to be in the playoff confidently. I fully expect that. I also expect 2 SEC teams to be in the playoff, but as we approach the playoff and the selection committee makes their rankings, we'll talk about that more later and all that. So yeah, overall, Big Ten's officially done, thank goodness. ACC is pretty deep this year. There's at least a few more good teams this year, not necessarily at the level of Clemson just yet, but strong teams. The SEC is culminating down to a 2-man race between Alabama and Georgia, and we could very well see both those teams go at it twice this year, and perhaps both of them get in the playoff. The Pac-12 is officially back, and we're going to see more night games then, which I look forward to watching. And obviously the Big Ten versus the field this year. In the Big Ten, the Ohio State versus the field this year. It looks like Ohio State's going to do it again, and I fully expect them to come out guns blazing against the Big Ten. So yes, thank you all for watching. I never ask for likes or anything of that nature. I don't really care if you like the content I make. This is my content. I don't care how y'all feel about it, to be completely honest. But let me know in the comments below if y'all would like to see something. If y'all would like me to talk about a certain team, you want me to talk about a development in the college football season. How do I think this team's going to do? How do I think this team's going to do? Or something like that, or if you want me to review a certain game, give you a prediction, or maybe post-game on that, I will make sure to take care of that. So instead of leaving a like, if y'all will, just drop some in the comments and let me see what y'all want, and I can definitely try to make that happen in either the next podcast or the upcoming podcast with respect to what time or what day the event is that you're asking me to review or preview for that matter, and I'll make sure to do that for you. So thank y'all for listening for that matter, not watching. Thank y'all for listening. Hope y'all have a good day, and I'll see you back here next week.